Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 153 and it's titled Attack for Zero. Oh wait, it's actually lethal commander damage. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or working with a card that was suggested to us by a viewer, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is fully random. We found it when we hit the random button over on Scryfall, and if you haven't done that before to build a deck, I highly recommend it. It's a ton of fun. But our random card is Whirling Strike. So Whirling Strike is 1 and a red for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+0, gains first strike, and trample until the end of turn. Now, immediately when I saw this card, I knew this deck was going to be very interesting because combat tricks aren't something that gets used a ton in Commander, with the most prominent deck for them probably being Feather because it has a way to rebuy those cards. Now, with that being said, I specifically wanted to stay away from Feather because I knew kind of what the deck would look like. Instead, I also decided we would stay mono red and use a commander that I've actually never seen someone play, and that is Rosnakht, Heir of Rohgahh. So Rosnakht is 1 red mana for a 0/1 kobold warrior. She has Battle Cry, so whenever she attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until the end of turn. And she has Heroic, so whenever we cast a spell that targets Rosnakht, we create a 0/1 red kobold creature token named Kobolds of Care Keep. So you can kind of see what's going on here. If we have Rosnakht, we attack, we cast Whirling Strike, we are going to trigger the Heroic plus give Rosnakht a pump, and that's kind of what the deck is built around. Now, with that being said, let's take a look at some of the themes of the deck and see what else that we are working with. The first theme, probably the most obvious, is of course more combat tricks, and I tried specifically to find combat tricks that worked well with our commander while at the same time drawing cards. Because if we can keep a continuous flow of combat tricks, we can always have a full hand, we can always have a ton of creatures, and our opponents are never going to know if they're making profitable blocks or not. And one of the best cards to fit that idea is Fists of Flame, which is 1 and a red for an instant. Draw a card. Until the end of turn, target creature gains trample and gets +1/+0 for each card you've drawn this turn. So essentially, with no other buildup, Fists of Flame is 2 mana, instant, draw a card, give a creature +2/+0, and trample. Already, that's perfect for what we're trying to do. We're really aiming to give Rosnakht trample or some form of evasion, so that way she can get in and do some damage, and we want to be drawing cards. Since we've drawn 2 cards, Fist of Flame gives +2. If we manage to cast this at the end of a chain of cantrip-like combat tricks, we could get an additional +4, +5, maybe even +6 if we've really gone deep into the combat tricks. So Fists of Flame is a huge pump, possibly, for very little investment. Now, with that being said, we obviously have to look beyond Rosnakht to get some targets for our spells. There's a good chance once our opponents catch on to what we're doing, they'll start killing her as much as they possibly can because she's going to be the biggest threat. That is why we also have creatures in the deck that also have Heroic. And a good example of that is Labyrinth Champion, 3 and a red for a 2/2 human warrior, Heroic. Whenever you cast a spell that targets Labyrinth Champion deals 2 damage to any target. So this is great if we just want to start burning out the table, if we want to start just removing any creatures that are in our way. We can use it for player removal, creature removal, planeswalker removal. Being able to point 2 damage at anything just by casting a spell is very powerful and is a great way to pressure our opponent's life totals and make them question whether or not blocking is a good decision. Now, Labyrinth Champion, Rosnakht, they're not the only ones in the deck that do this, but obviously we can only highlight one at a time, so Labyrinth Champion gets that spot today. And finally, getting to our last theme of the deck, this is a very specific one because there's not a ton that fit this bill, but we want to find ways to give our combat tricks effects to every creature we control. And one of the best ways to do that is with Zada Hedron Grinder, which is 3 and a red for a 3/3 legendary creature goblin ally. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Zada Hedron Grinder, copy that spell for each other creature you control that the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. So there are both upsides and downsides to using this ability with Zada. The first is if we have something like Fists of Flame that draws a card, every single resolution of that spell will draw us a card. So if we cast it targeting Zada, and then we copy it for the other 4 creatures we control, we draw a total of 5 cards for 2 red mana at instant speed. And then the ability on Fist of Flame starts stacking, giving +2 to the first creature, then +3, 4, 5, and so on, exponentially growing our board. Now, that's the upside. The downside to this is that it doesn't trigger Heroic because we're not targeting a creature with the spell. Because it specifically says whenever you cast a spell that targets the creature, you do the thing. Zada copies the spell and then targets them. We don't cast the copies, so we don't get the heroic triggers. So there's a bit of a trade-off to be had. Typically, this is what you want to do later in the game. Once you've made a bunch of kobolds with Rosnakht, then you use Zada to just kind of pump up the whole team. But I wanted to highlight this as a theme because it is one of the most important pieces to the deck. Now, with that being said, we're going to move into the next piece of our deck tech, which is taking a look at some key cards. And the first key card that I want to highlight is very similar to Zada, but in most cases is actually a strict upgrade because that is going to be Mirrorwing Dragon. And Mirrorwing Dragon is 3 red for a 4/5 dragon. It's got flying. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Mirrorwing Dragon, that player copies that spell for each other creature he or she controls that the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. Now, for our purposes, this works the exact same as Zada. We copy a spell, we target everything on our board just because we targeted the Mirrorwing Dragon, and then we do everything else that we want to be doing. The other upside, though, is that it shuts down our opponent's removal. Because if our opponents want to remove the Mirrorwing Dragon with something like a Swords to Plowshares, they would then have to copy that spell for each creature they control, and then cast a Swords to Plowshares on every single creature they control, essentially just wiping their board to get rid of a single creature. Most of the time, our opponents are not going to be willing to do that, unless, of course, they're sitting around with no creatures or very few creatures, or maybe they desperately need the life or something like that. But it's a great way to fend off removal because your opponents are not going to want to wipe away their own board, especially when there's 2 other players at the table who won't be affected by this at all. So Mirrorwing Dragon is a huge benefit to this deck and a big upgrade over Zada in many ways than one. Now, moving on to our next key card, this one is a little bit different. So most of the time we're talking combat tricks, but the other thing that we haven't mentioned that also triggers heroic are auras. So Bravado is 1 and a red for an enchant creature. It's now an enchant creature aura. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control. The idea here is we put this on Rosnakht, which would immediately make a kobold token, and then Rosnakht gets +1/+1 for the kobold she just made. In theory, we should be able to make a ton of kobolds, meaning that every time we're casting a spell, we're getting an additional creature and an additional +1/+1 for Rosnakht, and it won't take long before our opponents are staring down what could be a lethal-sized Rosnakht because we just need 21 commander damage to knock somebody out. And we can always threaten that because our opponents are never going to know how much damage they're taking until they actually take it, because they have no way of knowing what kind of combat tricks we have. Bravado is a great way to add pressure to the board while building up our commander, making it harder to remove, all of that kind of stuff. So Bravado is very good in this deck. And then finally, our last key card is going to be Downhill Charge. Downhill Charge is 2 and a red for an instant. You may sacrifice a mountain instead of paying Downhill Charge's mana cost. Target creature gets +X/+O until the end of turn, where X is the number of mountains you control. This is, for all intents and purposes, the biggest pump for the lowest price that we could possibly get. So if we cast Downhill Charge and we have just 5 mountains in play, that's 3 mana for +5/+O, or we sacrifice a mountain and it's free for +4/+O, which is still very, very good. Now, ideally, we can cast this either at the end of a chain of other combat tricks, so that way when we sacrifice the mountain, it's one that's tapped, we don't have to worry about it, or we can just pay the 3 mana, we're also not opposed to that. But if we can cast this on something like Mirrorwing Dragon and give that to all of our creatures, all of a sudden at instant speed, our creatures are getting +5/+O, maybe even upwards of +8/+9. That is going to end the game very, very quickly. In this deck with the right cards, that's kind of the equivalent of just the mono red Craterhoof Behemoth. And I know that that's quite the comparison, but you've got to keep in mind that if we can do this after blockers are declared, maybe we've found a way to give all of our creatures First Strike, Trample, or Menace, something like that, this will end games. Downhill Charge, I really can't talk it up enough, but I will have to stop myself from going further because if I kept talking about it, that would be the rest of the video, and we do have to get to the deck at some point. So, with that being said, those are our key cards. The next thing that we're going to do is take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize very well together, and while they may not always be win conditions, they typically accrue enough value that I think they're fun and interesting to talk about. So the first of our cool interactions is going to be between a Crowan Conscriptor and Crown of Flames. So I mentioned earlier that we have a bunch of heroic spells in the deck, so we could technically replace a Crowan Conscriptor with any other heroic spell, and it would be kind of the same thing. Obviously, the effects would be different, but as long as we have a heroic creature, this is going to do roughly the same thing. Because a Crowan Conscriptor, 4 and a red for a 3/2 human shaman, heroic, whenever you cast a spell that targets a Crowan Conscriptor, gain control of another target creature until the end of turn, untap that creature, and it gains haste until the end of turn. Crown of Flames is what we're going to be using to target the Conscriptor, because it is 1 red for an enchant creature, aura. Pay a red, enchanted creature gets +1/+O until the end of turn. But the real key ability here is pay a red, return Crown of Flames to its owner's hand. This is, for 2 mana, repeatable heroic triggers. That means that if we have Crown of Flames in our hand and a Crowan Conscriptor in play, for every 2 mana, we get to steal another creature in play, untap it, give it haste, and then hit our opponents with it. Insurrection is a way to end the game by stealing all creatures, and that's a massive amount of mana. Crown of Flames is only 2. We can take relevant blockers, we can take relevant attackers. Heck, there have even been times where you could take combo pieces with this, steal your opponent's combos, and just win from there. So I really can't talk up Crown of Flames enough in this deck. I know I just said that about Downhill Charge, but there's a lot of very powerful cards in this deck that synergize very well with everything we're trying to do. So before I spend too much time talking about that one, let's move on to our next cool interaction, which is between First Day of Class and a Crowan Crusader. First Day of Class, 1 and a red for an instant. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains haste until the end of turn, and it also has Learn. Now, notably, we can't have lesson cards, but we can still discard a card and draw a card when we learn, so that could be relevant. And we're going to partner First Day of Class with a Crowan Crusader, which is 1 red for a 1/1 human soldier, has heroic. Whenever you cast a spell that targets a Crowan Crusader, create a 1/1 red soldier creature token with haste. So, if we have First Day of Class, we cast it, then we start targeting the Crowan Crusader with a bunch of our combat tricks, every single soldier that it makes is coming in with an additional +1/+1 counter. So now instead of making a bunch of 1/1s, we're making a bunch of 2/2s. And while that doesn't sound like a significant increase in power, it is quite literally doubling our damage output, going from maybe we make 5 1/1s and could do 5 damage to now 5 2/2s and can do 10 damage. And yes, the tokens that the Crusader makes already have haste, so that's not quite as relevant, but it could also be used for some creature tokens that are created by Rosnakht, and we have some other ways to make tokens in the deck as well. I just wanted to highlight the Crusader because being able to just do a ton of damage out of nowhere, yeah, our opponents might expect the 1/1s, but there's no way they're expecting the 2/2s. So I think that's a super fun interaction, and it warms my Boros heart to be able to just turn things sideways and just kind of beat people down in a game. So with that being said, let's move on from our cool interactions and get into the price of this deck. And this week, I gotta say, I am very pleased with the price of the deck because it is $30.94. That is almost a third, honestly, it's slightly less than a third of our total budget of $100. And a good portion of that $30 price tag comes from Bothersome Quasit, which has a massive $4.39 price tag. And while that doesn't sound like a lot in the grand scheme of things, it's quite a bit when the whole deck is only $30. However, I do think that Bothersome Quasit is a very strong card in this deck because it is 2 and a red for a 3/2 demon. It's got Menace, goaded creatures your opponents control can't block. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, goad target creature an opponent controls. One of the weaker aspects of this deck is that we typically want to send all of our creatures attacking all in the same turn, meaning we don't have a ton of defenses. But if we attack with a bunch of creatures and then cast 3 or 4 combat tricks, we can not only remove blockers because we're goading them and they can't block when they're goaded, we also show that they can't come our way. They have to attack our opponents. And if they have to be attacking our opponents and they're not attacking us, that's really just furthering our own game plan because now our opponents are taking extra damage. So Bothersome Quasit really is an all-star in this deck. And I would highly recommend keeping it in the deck if you can, but if you do need to trim for budget purposes and get the total deck price down to about $25, you could cut the Quasit. There's a bunch of other cool mono-red combat tricks that we didn't include that I'm sure you'd be able to find a spot for. Now, on the other hand, if you're looking to increase the price of the deck, I can't really suggest a full out-of-budget upgrade because that implies I'm suggesting a $70 card, which I'm not going to do. But out of our current budget, if you have a card that you want to put in, I would recommend Skull Clamp. We make so many 1/1 tokens or 0/1s in terms of the kobolds, but we don't have a great way to draw cards beyond our combat tricks. Being able to sacrifice one of our tokens to draw 2 cards really powers up the deck and gives us a ton of different options. Because all Skull Clamp really is, I don't want to say a sacrifice outlet because it doesn't sacrifice, but it just trades our creatures for cards since it's just a 1 mana artifact equipment, gives an equipped creature +1/-1, and whenever the equipped creature dies, we draw 2 cards and it equips for 1. So we pay 1 mana, we equip a 0/1 kobold dies, we draw 2 cards. Pretty simple, pretty effective, and a great use of our mana. However, if you do have to put a card into the deck, then obviously you also have to take a card out of the deck. And if that's the case, the card I would recommend taking out is Ancestral Anger. Ancestral Anger, 1 red for a sorcery, target creature gains trample and gets +X/+0 until the end of turn, where X is 1 plus the number of cards named Ancestral Anger in your graveyard. Then draw a card. And you might be looking at this and wondering, 1, why it's in here if we can only have 1 Ancestral Anger, and the short answer is it gives trample, still gives a pump, and draws a card, which is really good. But the downside is that it's one of the few sorcery speed, well, I was going to say combat tricks, but I guess it can't be a combat trick if it's at sorcery speed, and you kind of see the issue there. Having to cast this before we attack means that our opponents have access to information that we don't want them to be having. And originally, I didn't think that was going to be too much of an issue, but after playing the deck a couple of times, I really found myself either not wanting to cast Ancestral Anger in favor of other spells, or casting it even after combat because I just wanted to draw the cards. And if that's what we're doing with Ancestral Anger, then Skullclamp is very clearly an improvement. However, it's not a terrible card in the deck. It does still serve its purpose, so if for budget reasons you need to keep it in, it's not going to hurt the deck overall. Now, with all of that out of the way though, that is our overall look at the deck. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. It's a pretty cheap deck. I'm very proud of that. And we do still have to see how this deck performs in a game. Before we get to that though, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So, as always, you can find some of our social media accounts at 13POYNZ over on Twitter, u/POYNZ13 over on Reddit. Send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. You can always just comment on this video as well. Please do like it, subscribe. It helps out quite a bit. And if you're looking to support us a little bit more directly, you can also find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. And I know the link to the channel member looks a little bit long. Don't feel like you got to type it in. It is in the description of the video. But if you're deciding to join one of those two things and join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Paddywhack, and Richard, joining them gives you access to things like the deck lists a week early, a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games on the channel. So if you want to participate in some of the games, that is a great way to do it. You get access to the unedited gameplay videos. You get a card shipped to you from me every single month as a thank you. It is one of the random cards that we build around. And then, in my opinion, the most important part of joining the Patreon or as a channel member is the guarantee that any card you suggest will be turned into a video for this channel eventually. Might take me a little while, but I will get to it. I will, of course, try to get to everyone's suggestions, so if you do have one, please do put it in the comments, send it to me over email, whatever. I will do my best to get to them, but I can't promise to get to them in the way that I can our patrons and channel members. So with all of that out of the way, let's keep things moving and actually get into a game with this deck. So this week, we're going to be joined by 3 different opponents, testing out some fun decks that we really haven't seen on the channel before. So this week, we are being joined by Jason playing Malcator Purity Overseer, Richard playing the 13th Doctor and Yasmin Khan, and Shawn playing Marneus Calgar. So starting off with Jason and his Malcator deck, this is what it kind of looks like. This is a golem deck. This is an artifact deck. He wants to just generate a ton of value, making a ton of golems, and he wants to make a ton of artifacts, and he's got ways of turning non-artifacts into artifacts and ways to benefit from drawing cards off of artifacts. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of shenanigans happening there, but I am very excited for it. Next up, we have Richard and his 13th Doctor deck. And from what I can understand, Yasmin Khan is kind of there for the colors. She's not super integral to the game plan, but the idea here is that he wants to put counters on things, untap them with his commander, and then with Yasmin, he wants to be able to exile the top card of his library so he can play it. This is all about casting stuff from anywhere other than his hand, typically from the top of his library, not necessarily from exile, but Yasmin kind of pushes it that way a little bit. So in that way, he's playing a bunch of Magus of the Future style effects. He wants to look at the top card of his library and cast it and be able to play lands from his deck. And this is a very unique twist on kind of the Exile Matters theme, things that like prosper. So I'm very excited to see what he can do. And I think it's a very fun color combination for it. I think a lot of those effects tend to be in red. So I'm interested to see what green and blue can add to that. And then finally, we have Shawn playing Marneus Calgar. And this is a token deck, but he's also focused a little bit on lands, being able to ramp out into his commander, which costs 5 mana and then has a 6 mana activated ability, but also wanting to just make as many tokens as possible so he can draw as many cards as possible, and then kind of just overwhelm the rest of the table. Now, I have to be honest, I haven't played against Shawn's Marneus Calgar deck, but I have played against Marneus Calgar in the past, and I think because of that, I do have to put Shawn's deck at the top of my priority list in terms of where I think the threat is coming from. Marneus Calgar is an incredibly powerful commander, and being able to have a mana outlet just in case he happens to make infinite mana, he can then make infinite tokens and draw infinite cards. There's definitely ways for this to become a problem at the table, so I have to assume sitting down that this is our biggest threat. Now, if you think I'm wrong, please do let me know in the comments, and as always, put down in the comments how you predict this game is going to go. Choose a winner, let's see if you're correct by the end of it. But other than all of that, I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. I hope you're going to enjoy the game. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by myself, Richard, and then Shawn. On Jason's first turn, he plays a Glacial Floodplain. I play a mountain and cast my commander, Rosnakht, Heir of Rohgahh, making a 0/1 kobold token whenever I target her with a spell. Richard plays a Breeding Pool tapped. Shawn plays an Esper Panorama. Jason plays a Plains and casts Azorius Signet. I play a mountain, then attack Jason for 0 with Rosnakht to send a message. And in my second main phase, I cast Soul Ring, followed up by casting Burning Prophet, which gets +1/+0 until the end of turn, and lets me scry 1 whenever I cast a non-creature spell. Richard plays a Mossfire Valley, then casts Sisterhood of Karn, entering with a +1/+1 counter, and doubling the counters on it whenever Richard casts a spell from anywhere other than his hand. Shawn plays a Reliquary Tower, gaining no maximum hand size, casts Arcane Signet, and also casts Mystic Remora, which has a cumulative upkeep of 1, and lets him draw a card when an opponent casts a non-creature spell and doesn't pay an additional 4 mana. Jason plays a Port Town untapped, revealing a Plains, then cast Azorius Cluestone, letting Shawn draw a card. I play a mountain and attack Richard for 1 and Shawn for 0, triggering Battlecry, giving the Prophet +1/+0. Before damage though, I cast Monstrous Rage, targeting Rosnakht. This lets Shawn draw a card, makes me a Kobold token, lets me scry 1, gives the Prophet +1/+0, gives Rosnakht +1/+0, and enchants her with a Monstrous Roll, giving her +1/+1 and Trample. Then damage happens with Richard and Shawn both taking 3. Richard plays a Cascade Bluffs and casts his commander, the 13th Doctor, letting him put a +1/+1 counter on a creature whenever he casts a spell from anywhere other than his hand, and untaps all his creatures with counters on them at the beginning of his end step. This also triggers the Sisterhood of Karn, doubling their counters to 2. He then attacks Jason for 2, and then untaps the Sisterhood at the beginning of his end step. In Shawn's upkeep, he pays 1 for Mystic Remora, keeping it in play, then plays a Swamp and casts Assault Intercessor, making an opponent lose 2 life whenever a creature they control dies. Jason plays a Plains and casts his commander, Malcator Purity Overseer, making a 3/3 Golem token when it enters the battlefield, and also making a 3/3 Golem token in his end step if 3 or more artifacts entered under his control this turn. At the end of turn, I cast Sarkhan's Triumph, letting Shawn draw a card, then searching my library for a dragon, in this case Mirrorwing Dragon, putting it into my hand. On my turn, I play a mountain and cast the Mirrorwing Dragon, so whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery that targets only the Mirrorwing, they copy it for each creature they control, and each copy targets a different one of those creatures. I then move to combat and attack Richard for 1 with the Burning Prophet. Richard plays a Rogue's Passage and casts Elven Chorus, letting him look at the top card of his library at any time, cast creature spells from the top of his library, and letting his creatures tap for a mana of any color. He's also unable to pay for Mystic Remora, so Shawn draws a card. In Shawn's upkeep, he pays 2 mana to keep his Mystic Remora, then plays a Scoured Barrens, gaining a life, and casts Zulaport Cutthroat, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever a creature he controls dies. Jason plays a Deserted Beach, and casts Encroaching Mycosynth, turning all his non-land permanents into artifacts and letting Shawn draw a card with Mystic Remora. He then casts Nettle Cyst, creating a 0/0 Germ token that's automatically equipped with it, giving it +X/+X, where X is the number of artifacts he controls, which is currently 7. Then, at the end of his turn, since Jason had 3 artifacts enter under his control, he makes another Golem token with Malcator. On my turn, I attack Jason with the Mirrorwing Dragon, Shawn with Rosnakht, and Richard with the Burning Prophet and the Kobold token. Battlecry triggers, giving everything except Rosnakht +1/+0, and before damage, I cast Whirling Strike on Mirrorwing Dragon, copying it for each other creature I control and giving them +2/+0, First Strike, and Trample until the end of turn. I also scry 1, give Burning Prophet an additional +1/+0, and let Shawn draw a card. Once that resolves, I cast Fist of Flame, targeting Mirrorwing Dragon, and copying it for each other creature I control, drawing a card for each of them, and then giving them +X/+0, where X is the number of cards I've drawn this turn. Then I also scry 1, give Burning Prophet +1/+0, and let Shawn draw another card. Finally, we move to damage, and Jason takes 9, Richard takes 17, and Shawn takes 8. In my second main phase, I play a Mountain and cast Swiftfoot Boots, equipping them to Rosnakht, giving her Hexproof and Haste. Richard cast Future Sight, letting him play with the top card of his library revealed, and letting him play the top card of his library. This also lets Shawn draw a card. Then he plays an island from the top of his deck, and, at the end of turn, untaps his creatures with +1/+1 counters on them. In Shawn's upkeep, he doesn't pay for Mystic Remora, sacrificing it. He then plays a tapped Choked Estuary and casts Felidar Retreat, letting him make a 2/2 cat token or put a +1/+1 counter on all his creatures and give them vigilance until the end of turn. And finally, he casts Talisman of Hierarchy and passes. Jason plays a Plains and attacks me for 14 with his entire board. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Stroke of Midnight, targeting Mirrorwing Dragon and copying it for each creature he controls, destroying them all and replacing them with 1/1 human tokens. Then, he recasts his commander Malcator, making a 3/3 Golem token, and moves to his end step, making another Golem token since he had 3 or more artifacts enter under his control this turn. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Goblin Matron, searching my library for a goblin, specifically Zada Hedron Grinder, putting it into my hand and then casting it, letting me copy any spell that I cast that targets only Zada for each other creature I control, and targeting them with the copies. I then cast Ancestral Anger, targeting Zada to give them +1/+0 and drawing a card. Then, since I copy the spell for each creature I control, they all get +1/+0, and I draw a total of 6 cards. Richard casts the 12th Doctor from the top of his library, giving the first spell he casts from anywhere other than his hand each turn Demonstrate, and also puts a +1/+1 counter on itself whenever Richard copies a spell. This triggers his commander, putting a counter on itself, and doubles the counters on Sisterhood of Karn to 4. Once that's resolved, he also casts Simic Signet from the top of his library, putting a +1/+1 counter on the 13th Doctor, and doubling the counters on the Sisterhood to 8. Notably, he also demonstrates the Signet, copying it and letting Shawn also make a copy of it, putting another +1/+1 counter on the 12th Doctor, but he couldn't have done this since it wasn't the first spell he cast from anywhere other than his hand this turn. He then plays a Cinderglade from the top of his library, and at the end of turn, Richard untaps all of his creatures that have +1/+1 counters. On Shawn's turn, he cast Martial Coup for X = 5, creating 5 1/1 soldier tokens and destroying all other creatures. In response, Richard casts Inspiring Call, drawing 3 cards since he controls 3 creatures with +1/+1 counters on them, then giving them indestructible until the end of turn, saving his own board while the rest of us lose ours. Then, when the board wipe resolves, it triggers both Zulaport Cutthroat and Assault Intercessor, letting Shawn gain 2 life, while Jason loses 16, I lose 14, and Richard loses 2. Once that's resolved, Shawn plays a Terramorphic Expanse, immediately sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped, and this also makes him 2 2/2 cat tokens with Felidar Retreat. On Jason's turn, he recasts his commander Malkator, creating a 3/3 Golem token. On my turn, I play a Tyrite Sanctum and recast my commander Rosnakht. I then cast Vindictive Flamestoker, putting an oil counter on it whenever I cast a non-creature spell, and letting me pay 7 mana, reduced by 1 for each counter on it, to sacrifice it, discard my hand, and draw 4. I also cast Scroll of the Masters, putting an oil counter on the Vindictive Flamestoker, and a lore counter on the scroll whenever I cast a non-creature spell. Then I can activate the scroll for 3 mana to give a creature I control +1/+1 until the end of turn for each counter on it. After that, I equip Rosnakht with Swiftfoot Boots, giving her Hexproof and Haste. This lets me move straight to combat, attacking Shawn for 0 with Rosnakht, and he blocks her with all of his tokens. Before damage, I cast Fervent Strike, giving Rosnakht +1/+0, First Strike, Haste, and making a Kobold. I also put an oil counter on the Flamestoker and a lore counter on the scroll. Still before damage, I cast Sandwich Sprint, giving Rosnakht +2/+1, Haste, scrying 1, making a Kobold, putting a counter on the Flamestoker, and putting a counter on the scroll. Finally, damage happens, and I lose Rosnakht while Shawn loses a cat and a soldier. On Richard's turn, he cast 1 with the Multiverse, letting him play lands and cast spells from the top of his library, and once per turn, cast a spell from his hand or the top of his library without paying its mana cost. This lets him cast Keeper of Secrets from the top of his library for free, demonstrating it so he gets an additional copy while Jason also makes a copy. This now lets him do damage to target opponent equal to the mana value of any spell he cast from anywhere other than his hand. He also puts a +1/+1 counter on the 13th Doctor, the 12th Doctor, and doubles Sisterhood of Karn's counters to 16. He then plays a Rejuvenating Spring and casts Leyline of Anticipation, letting him cast spells as though they had flash. Finally, at the end of turn, Richard untaps all his creatures with +1/+1 counters. On Shawn's turn, he cast Ashnod's Altar, letting him sacrifice a creature to make 2 colorless mana. He then plays an Urza's Saga, making a cat token, and sacrifices all 6 of his creatures to make 12 mana, allowing him to cast Zephyrim, using its squad ability to copy it 6 times. After that, he casts Skullclamp, and, at the end of turn, Richard casts Seedborn Muse from the top of his library, letting him untap all of his permanents during each other player's untap step, and he also demonstrates it, letting himself and I both make an additional copy of it. Then he puts a +1/+1 counter on the 13th and 12th Doctors, doubles the Sisterhood's counters to 32, and does 10 damage to me. In response, Shawn casts Counterspell, countering the original Muse, but unfortunately he can't stop the copy. Then, in Jason's untap step, he, Richard, and I all untap our permanents. In Jason's first main phase, he cast Master Splicer, creating a 3/3 Golem token and giving all his Golems +1/+1. He also casts Thought Monitor, drawing 2 cards when it enters the battlefield, plays an Exotic Orchard, and equips Nettle Cyst to Thought Monitor, giving it +1/+1 for each artifact and enchantment he controls, which is currently 10. In Jason's end step, he makes a Golem with Malkator since 3 artifacts entered under his control this turn. Still at the end of turn, Richard cast Magus of the Future from the top of his library, doing 5 damage to me, 5 damage to Jason, putting a counter on the 13th Doctor and doubling the Sisterhood to 64. In an attempt to save myself, I cast Enthusiastic Study, giving Vindictive Flamestoker +2/+1, putting a counter on it, a lore counter on the scroll, and then learning, discarding a card and drawing a card. I also sacrifice the Flamestoker, discarding my hand to draw 4, but nothing I find can save me, so I take 5 damage and get knocked out of the game. Still at the end of Jason's turn, Richard casts his commander Yasmin Khan, doing 8 damage to Jason, knocking him out of the game. Then on Richard's turn, he's able to activate Rogue's Passage, making his 128 power Sisterhood of Karn unblockable, using it to knock Shawn out of the game, and winning Richard the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a ton of fun. I was very happy to have a deck that just let me turn things sideways, because that is very much up my alley and what I want to be doing. So very cool to play a ton of the combat tricks in Commander. You don't really get to do that very often, so it was nice to play with a lot of cards that don't see a lot of love in Commander. Overall, I think our deck performed well. I think we crumbled a bit to a board wipe that happened and couldn't really get going again after that. But I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's nice to see that we can rebuild. We just didn't quite have the cards for it. So it's tricky trying to build between caring about non-creature spells and needing creatures to cast them on. So if you have any suggestions for cards that you think I missed or cards that you think don't really deserve to be in the deck, let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear what everyone thinks. But other than our own deck, let's talk about everyone else's as well. We'll go counterclockwise, I think is how it goes around the table, if I can remember things properly. Starting up with Jason and his Malcator deck, a very cool deck. I think getting the Encroaching Mycosynth out early really did him a lot of favors. Being able to turn everything into an artifact meant that he was essentially triggering Malcator every single turn. That also made his Thought Monitor super cheap. That made the Nettle Cyst do a ton of damage. So it was very cool to see the power of that from a very cheap card, which is kind of imitating Mycosynth Lattice in a way. So very, very cool deck. Hopefully we'll get to see that one again. Shawn unfortunately didn't get his chance to do too much. He did right at the end show some of the power of his deck, being able to drop an Ashnod's Altar, sacrifice his entire board for a ton of mana, and then make a ton of creatures. Was a very cool use of some of the tokens, like sacrificing them to turn them into other tokens, specifically ones with keywords. Very, very cool, and I would love to see more of that deck in the future as well. And then finally, of course, we got to talk about our winner, Richard, coming in with the top of the deck matters style deck. Very, very cool. I wasn't expecting a lot of the same cards that we had in our Nasari deck from a couple of months ago, but looking back at it, it definitely makes sense. There's a lot of cards that say when you cast something from anywhere other than your hand, and a lot of times they're built in a way to support Exile Matters strategies rather than top of the library. So it was super cool to see kind of the opposite in this case. And I also think that we stumbled a bit when the board wipe happened and then Richard could save his board. Typically being the only one left with the board after a board wipe puts you in a pretty commanding position. So I think that was the moment when we really realized we were in trouble. But this is another deck I would love to see again. I know I said that for everyone's decks, but it's true. They're all super sweet. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you enjoyed the deck tech and the game. Let me know down in the comments if there's any cards you'd like to see built around in the future. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching. Please do like and subscribe. We are so close to 1,000. I would love to hit it by the end of the month. So share with your friends, help us get there. But other than that, thank you again, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.